Okay, so that was, I barely mentioned minerals in the previous talk and focused mostly on protein and energy. And that tends to be what we do in thinking about cow nutrition, because we think of those as the big nutrients. We need them in pounds in their diet versus ounce, just a percent or two, or maybe even down to parts per million. And we tend to focus on the quantity needed and think that things needed in less quantity are less important, but in reality sometimes they're more important. So these are the nutrients that all animals require in the order of magnitude. So water, you may not think of water as a nutrient, but it is. And you need more water than you need of calories of energy in your diet or anything else in this list. And if you're deprived of water, it will hurt you faster than being deprived of energy or protein or a mineral. You will die faster of water starvation than any other nutrient. It's that important to us. But as I say, we get down here, we need most of these in parts per million. It doesn't make them less important. What it has meant is that as nutritionists, we focused up in here on energy and protein and know a lot more about that than we know about minerals, and especially about vitamins. The neat thing is, a lot of stuff has happened in recent years, and we know a lot more than we used to. And I'm going to show you where this talk used to end, and then what we've added in recent years based on new knowledge. So, another thing that complicates talking about mineral nutrition is there's lots of minerals that we know there's a requirement for. And there's probably more that we should still need to identify that could go on this list in terms of microminerals. We'd break our minerals into two groups. Macro, meaning we need large amounts of them. Micro or trace minerals, meaning we need a few parts per million in the diet. The trick with microminerals is we need just a few parts per million. Quite often, if we get a few more parts per million, we get into toxic levels. So we've got this deal where we know we have a requirement with a minimum level, but then we also have a maximum that we can't exceed. Further complicating the issue, you'll find out why we haven't studied mineral nutrition, because it's a can of worms. They all interact with each other. This little web, every line going across this web from one mineral to another is a known interaction we know between two minerals. That means that having one of them that interacts with another in the diet drives the availability of each other in the diet and how they affect that animal's health and performance. And I've got a few slides in here to discuss some of these interactions and important interactions that we know about that are important in this part of the world. So, a classic interaction, not necessarily a grazing livestock interaction, but just to give you the concept of interactions. The calcium and phosphorus are two of the macro minerals that are required in the diet, and some of the higher levels of any of the amounts of minerals required. But to make matters worse, not only do we need to meet both requirements, but the two interact with each other, and high levels of phosphorus will interfere with how much calcium gets absorbed from the digestive tract into the bloodstream of the animal, so it's available to the animal. And when you get that imbalance going, so you have basically your inadequate and available calcium, you end up forming urinary tract stones, kidney stones. Calculi means calculus-based kidney stones, and when they get caught in the urethra, the plumbing in a steer, and plug it up, you get water belly. So the thing that we all know with backgrounding weaned steer calves in the fall is that in most of our backgrounding diets, we have a calcium to phosphorus ratio that's closer to 1-to-1, or even sometimes backwards, and that's just not enough calcium. So we end up supplementing limestone in their diet because limestone's high in calcium, so we can get that calcium ratio back up to a 2-to-1 ratio. It can range anywhere between here, but ideal is 2-to-1. And we do that by adding additional calcium. Even though we may be exceeding the calcium requirement, we've got to get up above that surplus of phosphorus in their diet. Another important one in many parts of South Dakota, especially the West River half, is that we have high molybdenum in our forages, high sulfur in our water, and low copper in the system. And the moly, Molybdenum is hard to pronounce, so I'm going to call it moly. The moly and the sulfur both tie up copper. So we start off being borderline deficient on copper, and then when we tie that up, we end up with copper deficiencies. And this graphic is intended to show that, in that as the molybdenum level in the grass goes up, the absorption of copper goes down. All these lines curl down, meaning that absorption of copper goes down. And then the 4 lines show from sulfur 1 is a low level of sulfur in the diet or in the water up to the highest level at S4. The S1 curve, it just keeps shifting towards lower absorption of copper as you add more and more sulfur. So not only is high sulfate water potentially toxic to the animals and leads to polio that kills them, but even if you don't have it high enough to kill them with polio, you're still creating a copper deficiency just because of the high sulfur in the diet. Let's complicate the problem even worse. We've got all these diverse forages with all these, each one of them has a different level of most minerals in it. But then not only that, but availability of minerals, meaning does the mineral digest and absorb into the bloodstream, is not equivalent to the concentration in the plant. So you go out and you sample forage, and we're going to talk about sampling forage to create custom mineral formulations in a moment. Whoever formulates your mineral needs to know a little bit about availability of minerals in that forage, because just because they discover that your forage has a certain level of, let's say, copper in it, he's got to look at those things like sulfur level and molybdenum level and adjust for that when he actually formulates your diet. It's different between grasses and broadleaves, just like we showed you in a couple of those slides. It decreases as the plant matures, just like everything else does, all other nutrients do. And it varies tremendously based on what minerals are in the soil, because a plant can't have a mineral if it can't absorb it out of the soil. And it either has to be there in the native soil or you have to add it as a fertilizer, as in you put sulfur in your fertilizer. Typically we don't do a lot of fertilizing, particularly of these sorts of minerals beyond, maybe phosphate, maybe potassium, maybe sulfur. More than likely we're going to live with the minerals in the plant material that the animals eat, and then we're going to supplement the missing minerals as a supplement to the animal. But the right supplement over here could be very different from the supplement on your neighbor's place, simply because your soils are different than his. And the right mineral in West River is going to be way different than the right mineral East River, because there's just a huge difference in soils. So just a few glaring generality about mineral issues for grazing cattle. Calcium levels tend to be adequate in most forages. Phosphorus levels tend to be low and are often deficient, especially in mature forages. So in a totally forage-based diet, we don't have to worry about that calcium to phosphorus ratio getting out of whack. When it happens is when we put those steers on that backgrounding diet in the feedlot, and we put some grain in the diet, and grain's high in phosphorus. That's when we start getting out of whack on calcium to phosphorus. Potassium levels tend to be excessive, but when Dan and Jim's turns comes out, you're going to find out from Dan that that's not always the case. I say it tends to be, but it's definitely not always the case. And magnesium levels can be deficient, especially in spring with lush green grass. And a combination of excess potassium and deficient magnesium leads to grass tetany, which, if you're not on top of it, leads to dead cattle really quickly in the spring on lush, cool season forage when it first greens up in the spring. Now, I could really make this boring fast and put you all to sleep if I started doing a slide like this of every mineral in that list. And had to do that in college, taking principles of animal nutrition, and I slept through several hours of nutrition lectures because this mineral stuff got so boring. And I'm not going to do it to you. I'm going to do one just to show you one important mineral. Phosphorus is important because it does 3 really important things. And every mineral does something important. And my point is not to make you memorize lists. It's often deficient in forages, so it can be an issue we need to supplement. And typically, we've supplemented a lot of phosphorus to cattle through the years. Come back to that later. We know based on the nutrient requirement tables that I mentioned earlier that mature beef cows require about 12 grams of phosphorus a day. If it's deficient in the forage, we can administer it in a supplement. We can mix it in with other feeds. We can mix it in the salt. Commonly used products to provide that are dicalcium and monosodium phosphate. Particularly dical is one of the more common ones. The calcium's just along for the ride. Typically, it's the phosphorus that we need to put in their diet. This is a byproduct of fossil fuel production, so it follows fuel prices, and right now it's danged expensive. So the old days of just saying, well, they're probably deficient in phosphorus, let's throw a bunch of dical out there. We no longer can afford to just provide it in abundance. I mentioned grass tetany with magnesium, so I'll be brief on this slide. It's a problem in the cool of the spring when cool season grasses warm up, and it's driven by the fact that in cold soils, potassium levels, if the potassium levels are high, it's readily absorbed by the plant when the soil is cold. But magnesium is poorly absorbed by the plant when the soil is cold. So it creates a plant with a lot of potassium in it and not much magnesium. And particularly in a newly lactating cow with a really high nutrient requirement because she's lactating, it sets her up for grass tetany. It's that magnesium to potassium imbalance. Supplementing magnesium can help prevent the problem. I talked about copper and its interaction with molybdenum and sulfur. It also can get bound up by iron. They all bind it up so it's less available. The problem with copper is, once again, it's expensive to supplement, but second, it's one of those I mentioned earlier that there's a minimum requirement to meet, but there's only a few more parts per million and you hit the toxic level. So you don't want to just think, well, that guy told me I might be deficient in copper, so let's put a heavily copper fortified mineral supplement out. That may backfire on you because you could get into toxic levels if you don't need it. Here's another place I could bore you to death, is to show you all the lists of symptoms for all the different minerals. And another problem is many of the symptoms are the same in every list. Things like depraved appetite means they eat weird things, and lameness and just ill thrift means they're losing body condition. Okay? They'll all do that. The neat one in the copper list is this spectacle appearance. Black cattle will get rough red hair coats, but a lot of things will lead to a rough red hair coat. The unique thing about the copper deficiency is they look like raccoons. Their whole body, their muzzle, their forehead, and up over their poll is all red rough hair, but there's a goggle shape of shiny, pretty black hair around their eyes. And that's a really distinct symptom of unique to copper. So like I said, part of this talk is something that I've used for years and years, and this is where that part ends, and everything from here on is the new neat stuff. But this is what I used to end this talk with as recently as, well, I don't know, 6-8 years ago. You should at a minimum provide plain white salt all the time, best if it's a trace mineralized salt that's locally bought so that it's the generalized formula that's supposed to fit your part of the world, meaning West River versus East River. You should supplement phosphorus when forage is dormant, because even though I'm saying we need to not over supplement phosphorus because it's expensive, in most cases it's guaranteed you'll be phosphorus deficient if you're grazing winter range. Supplement magnesium in green lush grass in the spring. Supplement copper, but only if the symptoms are present, and then you better start doing some blood and liver sampling to make sure you get it right. And then I used to say you could create custom blends, but I didn't really know what that meant, and I didn't have a clue how a person would actually make that work. And most people didn't have a very good idea. You could kind of guess at it, but then we learned a lot more about it, and some people got pretty good at working that out, and that's Dan and Jim are going to talk more about it. But so I'd like to introduce the custom formulations idea, and then Dan and Jim are going to come up because they've got considerable experience on their ranches with custom mineral formulations. So we know that the content varies based on mineral content of soils. I mentioned that earlier. And so this custom formulation is to react to the unique characteristics of your ranch. And the goal is to develop this mineral package then that fits you and you only. It helps you avoid excess mineral feeding. So one of the issues we have is the EPA gets real excited anymore about nutrients being released into the environment, and especially on the East Coast and West Coast, they're really big on phosphate contamination in bodies of water like the Chesapeake Bay. And farms out there, livestock farms in Delaware and New Jersey and Maryland and Virginia, the states that surround the Chesapeake Bay, are heavily regulated anymore for how much phosphorus they can feed and how they manage their manure, because of excess phosphorus in the manure that ends up in the water. Now, you may think, well, we're immune from that. Well, we're immune from that for now, but someday the EPA will find us out here. Prevent interactions and antagonisms like the copper, sulfur, and moly interaction deal. Prevent toxicities, in other words, avoid overfeeding, and save a boatload of money by leaving out expensive minerals that are in the generalized packages that you, in your specific case, just don't need. And so I'm going to skip this part about custom formulations because Dan in particular is going to talk about that, and we don't need to cover it twice. But here's an example of the money-saving idea if you discover you don't need as much phosphorus. Generally, a mineral package off the shelf will be 12% phosphorus, okay? And phosphorus costs about $1,000. Well, this is an old price. I imagine it costs more now because fuel prices are back up again from when I put this slide together a couple of years ago. But if back then it was $1,000 a ton for dicalcium phosphate at retail if you were buying it off the shelf to put into a mineral package. Each 1% phosphorus that you add to a mineral package is going to increase the price of that mineral package by $54 a ton. So that means that a 12% package is 12 times 54, and that's just the cost of the phosphorus in the package, say nothing of 24 more minerals that have to be added in. So if you discover through custom formulation that in your situation you only need 8% instead of the full 12%, you're leaving out 4% of phosphorus at $1,000 a ton. That'll decrease the cost of manufacturing the mineral by $216 a ton. And if you're feeding that at 3 to 4 ounces per head per day, like most mineral packages are designed to do, that's going to be a savings of a little over $7 per cow. And if you're running a sizable operation, that can turn into real money. So is it worth it? You're going to learn the procedure later. And the upfront procedure is a heavy investment in monitoring your forage and hiring a nutritional consultant to mix these mineral packages and monitoring the system and making adjustments for several years to fine-tune it and get it right. Is it worth it to put that effort in up front? And, well, the benefits are that you can improve your animal performance, at the same time you cut costs, and the cost is that upfront investment. So listen to Dan and Jim and think, is this something I'm willing to do? And if I start it, am I willing to stick with it for several years? Because the payback comes later in life, because up front you're going to spend a chunk of money for a later on savings.
How many different minerals do I need? I mean, right now we're working with 4 different minerals over a year. It seems like we're constantly changing mineral for different times of the year.
Well, now I get to give you my favorite answer. That depends on your place. It depends. And you're going to find out from Dan and Jim the evolution they went through to go from sampling on a monthly basis to find out how many they needed, down to 4 mineral packages, and then down to each of these guys, they got 2 or 3 packages now. They'll tell you more about that later. But that's another potential benefit of the process, is that you'll learn more about how often you need to change the mineral package that best fits the situation of the moment. Okay, it's time for me to turn the floor over to Dan and Jim.
If you remember from yesterday, one of the things that we identified was waste of feed. That not only translated into our actual feed production, but our mineral program. we were spending a lot of money on a mineral program that we were still having problems with. And when nutrition's not right, there's a lot of things that aren't right. And we were seeing health things that we weren't real happy with, especially eye problems, foot rot, a few too many open cows, struggling with body condition score some, and so we again knew we needed to evaluate. One of the things we did, and I mentioned yesterday, is go to Dick Diven's low-cost cow-calf nutrition course. That was a real eye-opener. I think I also mentioned I had to take it twice to really absorb what all he was trying to tell us. But in the course of taking that, we came to the fact that we needed to look at custom mineral mixing. And we soon found out that one mineral made by company X for everybody up and down the road is not adequate. And there's a huge difference, and I'll show you some of those differences. There's a huge difference between my operation, probably the next one. There's a difference between different forages. You brought up the question about having 4 minerals and always chasing that. There's a reason for it. You aren't doing that wrong. You might not be doing it right either, but the fact that you're identifying needing more than one mineral mix, I would suggest is correct. And so I want to show you some of the things that we started learning. Dan's going to talk about the sampling, so I'm not going to get in that a lot, other than, like Ken mentioned, what we did is sample our forage once a month on whatever the cattle were eating, especially during the growing season, which isn't typically when people test feed. And then if we were using any stored feed, we just tested that once, of course, for the season. But if we were grazing, we tested once a month for about 5 years. The recommendation is at least 3. Just to start off with, this is Dan and my winter mineral that we're using right now, and start looking at some of the differences, especially as Ken mentioned, the potassium difference, the selenium level on some of those, and other things to note is that both these minerals programs have vitamins in them as well. The vitamin program is equally important. But start looking at some of these differences. And again, this is a winter mineral, and look at the difference in potassium between mine and Dan's. And it boils down to the soils that you have available and the forage that grows on those, and there can be huge differences. Also look at the selenium level. And Ken also talked about copper, and look at the differences there. I needed a lot more copper than what Dan did. And so there's just no way that you can go to the feed company and buy minerals that are exactly right for you. And as Ken said, go.
Point out again where each of you live so they
realize
sure.
The
difference in locality
Yep.
and soils.
I'm north of Highmore, which is pretty close to the center part of the state, about 60 miles east and a little bit north of Pierre, and Dan lives at Belvedere right next to the Badlands. So West River versus East River, but I suggest to you that's not the only difference. It's not as automatically as drawing that line. And for sure, don't go copying down our formulas and go home and think you're going to use them at your place. You may have the worst wreck you ever thought. You could build up some real toxicities. Some of these formulations get real high. Potassium, again, as an example. Not that potassium's toxic, but Dan will explain to you how cattle will eat and not eat that particular formula, and it's just like night and day difference. So your cattle might not eat it at all. So avoid what we're saying as far as using that particular formulations at your place. It's the theory that counts. If you look at winter versus summer mineral, and this is on my place, start looking at the differences again. Ken talked about phosphorus and how expensive that is, and when you look at a lot of minerals having phosphorus in it during the summertime, you're wasting your money. The only reason this particular formulation has 0.57% in it for the summer is because it came along in another product in the ingredients. We really didn't need any. It was just in there, and sometimes you'll see that even in a product like iron. We never need iron, but yet some of the ingredients that go into that supplement have iron in them anyhow. So it shows up on the analysis. Don't necessarily need it. I guess one of the other things I wanted to comment is, yesterday and all through this course, you've heard about diversity. Even though we stress our supplementation and putting out there what we really want to have on the land from an adaptive standpoint, what we really want to do is change our diversity on the landscape to the point that we maybe won't need any mineral at all. I think that's real possible. And when you look at the value of some of these deep-rooted forbs and shrubs, things like lead plant, what's the value in those? Whenever we change paddocks and go into a new one, our mineral consumption basically drops to zero. And it's because of the diversity out there. They are satisfying their needs, or they would be eating it. And then the longer we go into that grazing period, why then they level off at the amount they're supposed to be eating. And Dan's going to talk about sampling, but one thing I want to throw out before he even starts on that is it's amazing how, if you have correctly sampled your forage, how amazingly accurately they'll hit the consumption, the recommended consumption on a mineral mix. And if we see our cattle not eating it or overeating compared to what they're supposed to be, and it's typically 2-3 ounces, and if they vary a lot from that, there's something wrong with the formulation. Either you didn't take the correct samples, or you've changed pastures, or something's changed. And it goes along just that accurately with what they're supposed to eat if your analysis is right. So Ken mentioned that this can be a lot of work. It's not a lot of work. It's a chore. I mean, it's not that big a deal to take a grass sample once a month. The disheartening part about that is you don't really know where you're at until you build up a database over a couple years, because you always got that variation. So the first year you're kind of shooting in the dark and sure don't want to have too much of it formulated at one time, because the cattle may not consume it right, and then you're stuck there with mineral that they don't like. The outfit that both Dan and I deal with, if that happens, they'll actually take the mineral back and remix it, if you will, into the next formulation, correct the formula to where you can put it back out there and use it. It's not like you got to haul it out and dump it someplace or anything like that. But it is very important to have correct nutrition out there, and we feel that this has really corrected a lot of problems that we've had, and it's cheaper. Again, remember what Ken said, a ton of dical's worth by the old pay scale, and so it is huge, the amount of money you can save, not only on the formulation but in health and nutritional performance. So I'm going to turn it over to Dan to talk about clipping and...
Okay, I'd like to ask a question. Why the heck are we talking about minerals at mineral supplementation at the grazing school? I mean, you're here to learn about grazing, and we're talking about mineral supplementation. Anybody want to venture a guess?
If you don't have your minerals balanced, they can't use the grass right.
Excellent answer. And I'll build on that answer by saying that what we're working on, what we're trying to teach here, or part of the curriculum, is that grazing isn't just from the 1st of May, the grazing season, to the end of October, or when grass is growing. Good grazing management can go 52 weeks out of the year, or until the snow covers up your grass. This This is called opportunity. So in order to do that, when you start pushing the envelope a little bit, stressing your cows and getting them into grazing situations they haven't been in before, they need to be balanced. And if your cow is decreasing in body condition, then your grazing thing isn't working, and you're moving them or whatever, or they're in a pasture, it's not working. So you need every possible advantage to make the grazing part of it work. So that's the right answer, balancing the cows, and I like that. Now, how do you do it? Well, there's several steps. First is to go out and get a sample out in the pasture so that a lab can analyze it. Send the sample to the lab, and the lab says this is what's in there. And then that report goes to the guy that mixes the mineral, to the plant. And then they ship it out and it ends up in your shop. Okay, how do we clip? First of all, it's useless if you don't do this stage properly, because if the cows are eating this a certain type of forage and you clip something else, then we've defeated the purpose. So back out to the pasture and take a look at what they're eating. And you can do that in two ways. You can look at the grass and see what they've been working on. And the other way is to just walk along by your cows and watch what they're eating. And when they take a bite of something, you take a clip of the same thing. And a lot of times after you get into this, you can really tell because you learn to recognize freshly grazed grass. And you can tell what they're after that week, or during that period of time that you're testing over. I use Ward Lab in Kearney, Nebraska, and it costs it's the expensive one, I think. I think they're up to about, wet chemistry is $90. I've heard some guys are getting it done for $50 or a little under. But if the lab is right, that's immaterial if it's a good one. But here's the process. I'd go out and clip, and I did this 4 times a year, 4 seasons a year, several times during each season for about 3 years. And Jim did more than I did. He sent in more samples than I did, which is better. The more you send in, the better. But I'd go out and clip, say it's the 1st of May, put it in a bag, mail it to Ward Lab. Ward Lab would, within a day, 24 hours, would have that analysis up on my email, and I would forward that email to the mineral place, and within a few days, it would be mixed. Large batch, small batch. You need to find a place that'll do small batches, so you're not buying a semi-load of this stuff and it doesn't work. This is a trial and error thing. You want to be able to start with small batches so you can see what kind of response you're getting. If you're right, these cattle will eat the exact amount that the consumption is supposed to be based on what your mineral guy, custom mineral man, analyzed. If he says they're supposed to eat 6 ounces and they eat 2 ounces, you've made a mistake. Didn't clip right, season changed quick on you, something happened. So that's kind of the indicator. Any questions about that part before I go on?
When you're clipping for samples, you're doing each pasture separate, or taking?
Okay, the question is, where are you clipping? You have cattle in different pastures, right? Yeah. And how do you know? Okay, well, on my place along Highway 44, it's to the north end, that's the south end, to the north end is about 7 miles. And there's a big difference. There's definitely a difference, a lot of years. And this is the part where after you get into this and you work with it for a while, you start making those adjustments yourself. So if you've got, and I don't have a mineral package for the south end, one for the north end, but I do have a green grass mineral and a dormant grass mineral. And we've had situations where the grass was green enough on the south end that we could feed that mineral there, and we were feeding the dormant grass mineral on the north end. So I've got about 4 different minerals, that one for the calves in the wintertime, 1 or 2 depending on what we're doing, one like a green grass mineral, and one that is a dormant grass mineral, and then we have used one that's kind of an in-between. And you can go farther than that. It's up to you. You can do all kinds of, you can have 4 or 5 or 6, but it just has to fit your resource, your labor resource, your time, your interest, and all that. Any other questions about this part of it before I, yeah?
Like year after year, when you're going back to that same pasture or same time of year, can you still use that same mineral that you did the year before, or do you cut again that year and get your analysis?
You can keep testing, and that'll tell you after about 3 years, you'll get and the question is, can you keep using the same mineral in the same pasture? We basically have mineral for our ranch. So I do that. Does that answer your question? One of the things that I've noticed is that the mineral imbalance issues we had before I started doing this have gone away. So in the 90s, we had a lot of trouble with grass tetany. We were calving in April, and we'd get a little freeze on western or especially crested early in the morning, and we'd have grass tetany. And I was out there putting out magnesium mineral with molasses in it and mixing it, and just, okay. When I started this, I was really nervous because we weren't putting any molasses in it. I thought, man, this is dangerous. Well, I kept talking to the consultant, Dick Diven, and he said, we're just dealing with imbalances. Don't worry about it. And he was right, that the reason that we were having to put molasses in there to get them to eat that that magnesium was that we had the mineral thing so out of balance. We couldn't even get them to eat the stuff they needed. And with this, with this mineral, this program, as they phase out of that dormant grass in the winter, in the spring, onto green grass, their consumption tells you when they need that mineral with the magnesium in it. We don't need any molasses, or sugar to get them to eat it, and no grass tetany. Now we start calving in May about the same time, and so we got a little bit of a skewed sample here, but we had plenty of grass tetany in May before, and we don't have any now. This is 10 years. Here's an example of how this mineral thing can be really a big deal. My neighbor calves out in April on crested wheatgrass, one pasture. He lost 9 cows a couple of years ago. And so I went down and visited with him to see if I understand what was going on. Here's what he did. He's conscientious. He's a good guy, good rancher, takes care of his cows. He was so worried about this deal, he put out 3 different grass tetany minerals. And he wanted to cover all the bases, make sure they got all they needed. Well, he had one that had lots of molasses in it. Magnesium. It had that one would, if you'd put it out by itself, it would have probably solved the problem, maybe. But what they did was they went to the one that had all the sugar in it, and it had the least amount of, that'd be molasses, least amount of magnesium. So they didn't even eat the ones that would have helped them. They ate the one that was, so that kind of thinking can really get you into trouble. This balancing approach is avoids that kind of scenario.
Hey, Dan?
Yes.
You mentioned magnesium for grass settlement with cows that are not lactating, meaning with cows that haven't had it yet. Or do they have to have a calf before they're going to get grass fed?
Yeah, that's my experience, is that the grass tetany becomes an issue when they're lactating and they're pulling that magnesium out of their system and they can't replenish it fast enough with the forage. Ken, am I on track? Okay.
But the reality is it can happen with non-lactating cows, because we saw 2 years ago when we got a green up in the fall, we had people, their cows dying in the fall from grass tetany. And we just got a rain and grass came on, and there was a guy that lost over 20 cows to grass tetany, and they were not lactating, they were already weaned.
And I could add an experience that my dad had even before I took the operation over with winter tetany. Weren't even close to calving time, and the cows were just flat starving to death. I mean, they had zero internal fat if you posted one of those cows. And it took vets, including the state veterinaries, months to figure out what was going on. It wasn't a typical thing, and that was one of those situations back before people really tested feed and stuff that they finally determined that it was a magnesium deficiency that was just tying up all the nutrition, and it was a devastating thing and wasn't even close to the typical grass tetany time. So it can happen other times.
Okay, now the next question? That's just where I was going, and it's a good question, because this is the common recommendation for years has been that cattle recognize a deficiency in one mineral, and that is salt. That's been the common recommendation. At my place, if I go out on dormant forage the middle of January and put out potassium, they'll about run over me to get to it. If I do that in May when there's green grass growing, they could care less. And it is such a big deal for them that when we have a bunk with our winter mineral in it here in the middle of March, and it's got potassium, half and half, 50% of it's potassium, and a bunk here with summer mineral with no potassium, they will be eating the potassium mineral on dormant forage into the spring. As soon as we start even getting sedges, that they're green, they start backing off of that, and as soon as the green needle and cheatgrass, western, whatever little bit of green they're getting, they won't touch it. So they do recognize deficiencies. Now, here, we don't know very much. I mean, I'll be the first to say what, and I think these other guys will agree with me, this is an area that has not been researched well enough. So we can't, I'm saying I don't know a lot about this. Why do, how can a cow determine a deficiency? I don't know. But we're pretty clear that they do, and I've even tried the buffet mineral thing, in the bunks. Have you done that? Okay, I want to talk to you more about that, because that's really interesting. Where each mineral is independent of the rest of them. Maybe you got 14 or 15, and what I found was that they do select every day different minerals, but it takes so much labor to keep that up, I quit doing it. But it did confirm that they identify lots of deficiencies.
Can I comment here, Dan?
Yeah.
So this goes back to that diet selection and sampling thing. They're going up to Dan's got 2 minerals out at once, and they're sampling his 2 mineral feeders, and they're figuring out that this one with potassium in it, when they're potassium deficient, makes them feel better, so they keep eating it. But the day that they're getting enough potassium in their diet and not enough magnesium, because they start eating that new green grass, they go, that one didn't make me feel as hot anymore, but this one over here, all of a sudden, it does make me feel better. So they switch. And they'll do that as long as you don't mask it with another flavor. And I think this comes to what you're asking, Lon, is that if we try to help them make that decision by sugaring it up, assuming that since we like Snickers bars better than celery, they'll do the same. Sometimes it works that way, sometimes it doesn't. But what we're really doing is we're just masking the association they should be creating.
So we can mess it up.
We can mess it up by hiding the thing they should be cueing on to couple the feedback with.
And do we know how to do it right? No.
So that's what's happening to his neighbor. His neighbor, if all three of those supplements were sitting out there and none of them had molasses in it, I'd put a sizable chunk of money that they'd pick the right one. But then he turned around and sugared one of them up and made them switch to it even though it wasn't helping them.
And you know, we do not understand this well enough, is I should qualify that. We're starting to understand that they recognize deficiencies, and we need to be understanding that we need to work off of that. But we don't know enough yet to say we're really good at this. Now, what did you find with the buffet minerals?
Some part of the seeds they use it's picking different minerals. It wasn't the same.
So they were identifying. He's saying that it isn't always the same. That they choose different minerals at different times.
Except different seasons or different grasses, they were never the same.
Yeah, and that's crucial. Different minerals when they're grazing different grasses.
And that's why it's so important to have these different formulations. You know, you asked the question about, you thought you were kind of chasing your tail having that many formulations, and that's why I suggested perhaps not. You know, Dan says he has 4, so we've actually got more than that. And one of the other things we do, and a real cheap source of protein, which Ken talked about, we'll add urea in if we are in a drought situation or on dormant grass yet. And of course that takes some real management. You got to really be careful with it. But it's a very cheap source of protein, and so when we get into that dormant mineral that Dan and I both use, if we've got calves on them, if the cows are really short of protein, after we wean our calves, we'll put urea in that mineral. Another thing that you got to remember, and is very important to test, all we've talked about is grass, but the water is equally as important. Remember Ken said the most important? Well, that would suggest that it might be the most important to test as well. You get into some of these artesian well waters, and they can really throw things out of whack in a hurry because of the sulfur-copper moly relationship and magnesium. Those waters can be very misleading. And then I know what you're thinking, well, boy, I've got 10 dams and 2 wells and use some real water, and that's correct. We don't worry about our surface water. If you have something that you think is unique, I would suggest testing it, but we do test our well waters separate and keep that in mind in our formulations, because typically when we're using a summer formulation, they're in an area that's using this type of water. If it's a winter deal, they're more apt to be using this water. So it gets back to kind of like Dan testing from one end of his ranch to the other. Yeah, there's still some variabilities in there, but you're way closer than buying it off the shelf. The other thing I wanted to mention, and I brought up briefly health problems. We used to have a lot of problem with eyes, and we called it pink eye. I don't think it was similar, but irritated eyes anyhow that looked that way. And when we went to this program, we basically stopped it. Here a few years ago, that formulation was getting pretty expensive, and you always start second guessing yourself. Golly, like Dan's deal, you shouldn't need that much potassium there. Maybe we can get by with a little less. we were putting a lot of iodine in our formulas, and a couple other things, and we decided we could probably cheat that back a little bit, and we did. And we started getting eye problems again, and we went back to our old formulation and just eliminated it. So there is a lot of correlation to health and performance, and again, it's just amazing how well, if you've tested right, that these formulations will follow it. We're about out of time, but question?
Do you test your well water more than once, or
No.
do you just drop the well down and take a sample and that's what it is?
Yep.
Roger, how much time do we have?
You got 3 minutes.
Oh, that's a lot of time.
Well, we've got a break. So, we can see like when you put this mineral out there, you're, what consumes more? I mean, obviously are you doing it for your cows or your calves? Are they eating too?
Yeah.
Very different.
We see them all eating it, and it's probably super important for those calves to be able to eat it first, or as well. We used a couple different types of mineral feeders, and one of them is those lid type ones that they got to lift the lid up. We won't use those when we got fairly young calves out there, because we're concerned whether those calves will lift that lid and get in there. So we use open type feeders, wind vane type feeders, where we got calves. We want to make sure they're getting in there. If it's a bunch of old bulls or dry cows, we'll use the other type, but we think it's absolutely essential that those calves get in there, because they're eating the same grass or a little milk to go with it that's coming from cows that are on the same formula. I suspect they get some supplement through the milk, but they're also eating grass. So.
In the book, Roger, is there a contact for Custom Mineral in the book? Ken?
I think not.
Any other questions?
What do they?
No, it's not in here. You guys will need to give that to them. We've done that in past years.
Yeah.
I can give you one clue real quick. All you got to do is talk to Naomi. They're using the same program. Luke knows who to get a hold of as well, but they're using the same salesman. And he's kind of a unique salesman. He's not just there to sell feed. He does take into account what's in your best interest, because it's on his reputation as well, and he takes it real serious about trying to do what's best for the livestock. So if you are interested, you can ask either Dan or I, or Dave uses him, maybe somebody else, but I know the four of us anyhow use the same guy.
So we were talking about putting 2 different minerals out and them cows to pick the one they want. Can you get your 6, 7, 8, 10, 12 different formulas and just throw it all out there year round and let them cows pick what they want?
I wouldn't, because it does tend to get stale and set up and blow away and all that good stuff, and you're just wasting money out there. I never put out more than one. Evidently Dan does when they might want to be switching, but I don't. We can usually tell just by consumption. If they start backing off the winter formulation, why they're getting green grass or wherever we're at. We also have a formulation, like the pictures you saw yesterday, some of those cattle were on corn stalks. We have a special formulation for when we're on corn stalks. And actually they don't eat near as much or have as much demand on the corn stalks as they do like on dormant grass.
One company that does the buffet mineral thing, I worked with them for a little while. And I wonder if you didn't work with them.
Been 15, 20 years.
Yeah, they mix 2 or 3 minerals together, or 1 or 2 together. It's kind of a weird thing. I didn't understand it, but it seemed to work. There were still 12 different things, but that's the whole idea of the buffet, is that every day is different for a cow, and it makes sense, but boy, it's a lot of work.
And over and above the work, it's a lot of expense. That's the reason I quit it. Those cows were eating me out of home, and it took me back out of the reason I started this in the first place. Health-wise, it was probably fine, but it was way too expensive a program.
See, for me, it was just the opposite.
Really?
Yeah, they ate less. You know, so I was concerned about that I wasn't covering the bases, and so like I said, there's a lot of this we don't know. We're learning.